Good morning. My name is Belinda Redmond, the Director of State Promotions for the Department of Trade and Investment. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today to our Q&A session with Leonie Muldoon, the Chief Executive of the Department of Trade and Investment. Before I introduce you to Leonie, I'd like to share some information about the session. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded onto the department's website. There is a chance for you to see the other webinars and presentations we've been doing over the last few weeks. At any time during the presentation, you do have the opportunity to ask questions. You'll see the Q&A box located in the right-hand side of your screen. We also have to respond to your questions. Megan Ancliffe is joining us, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Department, and Justin Ross, who is the Director of Strategy, Policy and Analytics. If we don't get to your question due to time constraints, all questions will be answered and collated and summarised on our website. At the end of our webinar, we will be conducting a short poll to assist us in preparing for future events. We'd greatly appreciate it if you take the time to complete the survey. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Leonie Muldoon, Chief Executive for the Department of Trade and Investment.
Thanks, Belinda, and good morning, everybody. And look, thanks so much for tuning in today. It's almost impossible to believe that we are only 90 days since Australia recorded its first COVID-19 case. It's impossible to think of a time when so much has changed so quickly. And I know that many of you feel quite overwhelmed as you face very severe operating challenges and still a very unclear future. I think it's probably useful just at the get-go to realise that we were dealing right from the outset with an enormous number of unknowns. We were not clear how quickly COVID-19 would spread, what sort of case numbers would present, whether those cases could be managed with the resources that we had in the state, whether it was nurses or doctors or beds or ICU units or ventilators, and most importantly, personal protective equipment. So we were really quite in the dark, and some of the early predictions that were developed about how this virus might spread and the number of cases that we might encounter were quite overwhelming. So this unknown, if you like, created a predicament that meant that state and federal governments, not only here in Australia but internationally, were required to put an enormous amount of energy and effort into just making sure that we had optimal public health outcomes, because we weren't clear if it got bad, how bad it could get. The right priority, and one that I think has been universally supported across Australia. But it's one that's created a domino effect in parts of the economy. So today I wanted to unpick the various restrictions, the economic dominoes that have fallen over, and how the state and federal government and my own agency, the Department of Trade and Investment, have responded, and the measures that we've tried to put in place to mitigate the adverse effects of the pandemic. And look, like all crises, there has been some silver linings, and we'll track those as well. Once we look at all of the dominoes that have fallen, then we'll circle back and I think just take stock of where we are now, have a look at the current landscape and possible ways forward. So, beginning at the beginning. Some of the early dominoes fell without too much effect. In the side mirrors, we noticed that obligations on travellers that were arriving in from certain places, Hunan, later extended to China, then subsequently Iran and South Korea, were required to self-isolate for 14 days. At that point, I think the Premier was visiting Chinatown a lot and being seen to eat a lot of Chinese food, keeping up consumer confidence and making sure that xenophobic sentiments were kept under control. So it looked like the government was pretty kind of quiet, but in truth, a lot was going on. We had already identified that there were problems with personal protective equipment, and that we'd started to work with a local company, Detmold, to diversify their operations and work to commence manufacture of surgical masks that were going to be all critical to us in meeting demand during the crisis. That was the first of a number of silver linings that we've seen emerge in this crisis. In addition to Detmold, we've seen Datacom, a contact centre specialist, MicroX, a South Australian portable X-ray machine manufacturer, and Bickford's emerge with gin-flavoured sanitizer, ready for all occasions. So look, there's been many businesses in South Australia who've demonstrated incredible agility and have won COVID-19 response business. But before we all started to be fat and happy on Chinese food, the incredibly serious nature of the pandemic became apparent. We saw a ban on indoor gatherings introduced. We saw distancing restrictions imposed, and very soon thereafter, borders closed. The government doubled down on driving optimal public health outcomes. The next day, 23rd of March, really just over a month ago, pubs, licensed clubs, hotels, gyms, indoor sporting venues, cinemas, casinos, restaurants, cafes were closed. And those that remained open in the hospitality area moved back to takeaway only. Closures continued to roll forward, and the stay-at-home restrictions, stopping everything except shopping, medical care, and exercising, came into play. These very necessary and very important health measures had a myriad of economic consequences and attracted a myriad of government responses. First, and most important domino to fall, was that tragically many businesses closed. In response, the South Australian government moved to support South Australian businesses and the community with an economic stimulus package of more than $1 billion. In particular, there were two emergency job rescue packages, a $300 million business and job support fund and a $250 million community and job support fund. So these funds were really directed at trying to address individual businesses and immediately affected industry sectors, as well as community organisations that were facing potential collapse and loss of thousands of jobs due to this ongoing battle, if you like, with COVID-19. Under the Community and Job Support Fund, the government has been providing small businesses as well as not-for-profit entities that have been impacted by the pandemic with $10,000 grants that are really kind of critical to just supporting the operations, maintain some kind of viability in the background while we ride out this pandemic. There are, of course, opportunities that emerged from the crisis, and DTI stood up a COVID response team. So we looked very quickly at capturing new expansion opportunities for South Australian businesses. And there were lots in terms of diversifying into supply or production, for example, of medical equipment or surgical wear. We have a industry capability network portal. And what that does, it was an opportunity for us to connect organisations that had PPE shortages with potential local suppliers. It's a portal where companies can list capability, they can register and provide their details, and we're ensuring that all critical COVID-19 contracts are tendered on that site. So if you're not already linked into that platform, I'd really encourage you to think about that and make sure that you're connecting with all available opportunities. We're also representing South Australia at a national PPE roundtable. So that gives us eyes and ears on national demand, gives us an opportunity to hear very quickly where there are opportunities and make sure that our manufacturers are linked into those, whether it's face masks or ventilators, sanitizers or gown production, anything that we see that's emerging at a federal level or in the context of other states, we're trying to pull those out and feed those back to our manufacturers locally. With disrupted supply chains. It hasn't been easy sailing, even for those small group of companies that have been able to, in a very agile and capable way, pivot to these new opportunities. So we've been providing some case management support to help them access critical inputs, both locally and internationally. I've just heard this morning about some material that we are bringing back in from India and some response work that the team are helping with there. We've also been helping businesses to navigate border and air freight restrictions and to assist with medical and TGA certification and testing regimes so that we can get these products back to market quickly and help to support those businesses that have been able to take advantage of this COVID-19 work. We've been connecting companies with supply of ethanol to meet demand for hand sanitizers and continue to meet production for this essential healthcare need. And we've been assisting those same businesses in making sure that they get licensing requirements through quickly. There's something that's regulated by the ATO and just needed a little bit of cookie kicking down the road to make sure that it wasn't a barrier to us moving forward. So some small things, but critical to supporting businesses to diversify and to do what they can and to do it quickly to move before the opportunity moved away. The second domino that fell was, of course, a tragic number of people lost their jobs. In response, we saw the Australian government stand up $130 billion JobKeeper payment to keep more Australians in jobs, to keep them connected with businesses, and to make sure that we still had the sort of the structure around those businesses that might enable them on the other side of this to be able to restart and re-engage with customers. The scheme, as you know, offers $1,500 per fortnight to affected employers for up to 6 months, and they channel then that through to their employees. Not all businesses were shrinking. There were a lucky few that are actually expanding. And what we tried to do as a department was connect people who had lost their jobs with emerging opportunities in the state. And we stood up some banner ads on Seek.com, and we mounted an I Choose South Australians campaign. We were targeting growing businesses, encouraging them to list on the site. We then ran a social media campaign to connect work seekers to those opportunities via the site. So that's an ongoing piece, and we've seen a terrific response to that. We acknowledge that the growth is small in proportion to the number of people who are seeking to captivate or take advantage of those opportunities. But whatever is out there, we're trying to make sure that they are connected and connected quickly. The third domino that followed a little bit as night follows day was the complete cessation of international flights into Adelaide and large restrictions imposed on domestic flights. Really a disastrous development for our exporters and for our tourism operators. Our own Minister, Minister Ridgway, established in response an export support recovery task force to understand the precise position of exporters impacted by the elimination of international air freight. And DTI then linked those exporters with an available federal support scheme, $110 million international freight assistance mechanism that was established primarily to help businesses with perishable goods, agriculture and fishery sector to export into traditional target sectors, so China, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore and the UAE initially. There's a new network of 9 air freight service providers and 6 freight forwarders that have been established to really try and accelerate delivery of those exports into those key overseas markets. In the first 3 weeks, about 560 Australian businesses have registered to use this mechanism, and about 55 freight flights have been secured. We've been working behind the scenes with the International Freight Coordinator General, Michael Byrne, and we've secured 2 IFAM subsidised weekly flights, direct flights from Adelaide, one to Hong Kong and the second to Singapore. And separately, our team are working with local exporters and freight forwarders to make sure that we consolidate all air freight requirements and look how we can support potentially transitioning this short-term support into longer-term commercial direct flights out of Adelaide. If you're not connected with that work, really encourage you to come back to my department to talk to Justin Ross and to make sure that you understand what's available and how you can benefit from it. Sea freight, of course, continues, although we know that there are some delays at various ports and there is some congestion related to port staffing and health-based requirements that are being driven by COVID-19. Overall, export logistics is a really big part of what's keeping us up at night. On the tourism side, South Australian Tourism Commission has rolled out a range of programs to assist tourism industry during this period. The Small Tourism Business Grant Fund has been set up and a regional event grant fund. So again, if you're not connected into that, I encourage you to reach back to the South Australian Tourism Commission and make sure that you take advantage of that. Separately, we have business saving loans for exporters. So between 250,000 and 50 million are being made available under a new $500 million capital facility that will be administered by the Export Finance of Australia. So the old EFIC, we have a representative here in South Australia based in the same building as the Trade and Investment Department. So again, an opportunity to be thinking about how you can take advantage of that support right now. And finally, the Australian government's expanded the export market development grants, added an additional 49.8 million to allow for exporters and tourism operators to get additional reimbursement over this time, over and above what might previously have been available under EMDG. I guess it was predictable, but the fourth domino that fell was really around demand. Many of our clients had products, but had issues in regard to supply chains that had been disrupted and channels to market that were now closed. So my department, with our partner, Food SA, and a number of other commercial operators, doubled down on marketing I Choose SA, looking to try and launch campaigns to provide support to South Australian businesses, to help them actively promote their products, and to try and drive some consumer interest in consuming locally. We're working also with our clients to move them into online channels, and we're running global in-market webinar series that is designed to provide some insights from our overseas representatives. So in particular, to date, we've run seminars on China, Hong Kong, the UK, the US, Malaysia, and India. They've been designed to talk to you about the latest situation in the market on the ground, and we hope it's given a little bit of clarity about what's actually happening in those markets. On our website, we're pulling information from our key overseas markets and posting it on a daily basis, focused on giving you a kind of a trade and investment perspective. They're updated every business day. So as things change, we're trying to keep you informed about what's available. I guess too, I'd just like to encourage everybody to think about our overseas network. This is a time when it's very difficult or impossible for people to travel, to be there in person, to be talking to your importers and distributors and customers. But we have a network already in market. We can be your arms and legs and eyes and ears in the market. You yourself might not be able to travel, but you need to use us as your proxies to help keep your businesses moving in those key overseas export markets. The fifth domino that fell was many of our clients found that they were not able to move their valuable workforce across borders and was really struggling to keep their day-to-day operations in South Australia operational. So we work with many clients to stand up a single point of contact with SAPOL. so that our stakeholders had very up-to-date advice on border restrictions. They were able to facilitate travel across the border for essential activities with confidence. We're working with sister agencies, Department of Energy and Mining and primary industries, to negotiate protocols with South Australian Health and SAPOL to make sure that South Australian mining companies and agricultural businesses were able to safely move essential workers across state boundaries and just keep their operations operational. And the dominoes kept falling. Sixth, really related to our international students, our very important customers and critical stakeholders of the South Australian education sector. International students had also lost their part-time work and their ability to support themselves. But because of visa restrictions, they didn't qualify for support either under Job Seeker or JobKeeper. So last week, Minister Ridgway, on behalf of the South Australian Government, announced a $13.8 million support package to help boost the industry, to save local jobs, and to care for international students. We've already received over 11,000 international student registrations for the scheme. We're the only state that's moved directly to support this critical industry. So while we've flattened the curve, and we're delivering some very impressive public health outcomes at the moment, I think it would be foolish to think that more dominoes won't fall and that we won't be requiring additional and different support. Premier sought to stay very closely connected with South Australian businesses through the crisis, as has our own minister. So an industry response and recovery council has been established to help inform the Premier and Cabinet of the state's immediate and ongoing needs, economic challenges that have been created by the pandemic. Council's made up of 14 members, but Catherine Sayer of Food SA, Martin Hesse of Business SA, and Brian Smedley from the Wine Industry Association, critical to many of our export groups, are representing those groups and their members on the council. They meet weekly, it collaborates across all industries, and it's designed to ensure the economic survival of the state, put us in a great position for the Premier to be able to hear quickly what's happening on the ground and to be able to make decisions quickly to save livelihoods and ensure that we successfully transition to the other side of the crisis. So how can you also sort of stay in touch with what's happening? Well, we've got a very cross-agency communication channel set up. We've been working with our colleagues at the Department of Innovation and Skills. They've been utilising a businesssa.gov.au. It's our single source of truth for businesses. So if you haven't done so already, I'd encourage you to just jump online to check out the economic support packages and the business advice that's available on that site. We've been trying to help people find the site and direct them to particular programs that might be of interest by mounting social media campaigns. So we're trying to pull you to the site as well as hopefully see that you're going there directly yourselves and that there's high awareness of the opportunities to get that one source of truth on that site. All this is not going to address all of the aspects of the economic horror that has rained down on us in the last 90 days. We, like you, we're reacting, we're adapting, we're moving to deal with new ramifications of the restrictions as they present. Now we're seeing low or no new cases. We're turning, of course, to trying to look at how do we balance public health outcomes, very critical, with economic recovery and ensuring that we have social license, that people's confidence is being restored and that people are understanding the crisis to the best that we can, I guess, scope it at the moment and are able to see how we may be able to move forward. We've already opened the market back up to elective surgery, and of course this week South Australian schools are open. Consideration is being given to further restrictions and how we might move forward to release some of those. We're looking at high risk areas where we have many adults together in one place, therefore longer periods of time indoors rather than outdoors, issues where communication of the virus is potentially at its most dangerous. We're also looking at how do we continue to improve the testing regime, the emergency response, our ability to perhaps leveraging the app. I hope you've all thought about downloading that. I think it gives us a new opportunity to really enhance our case management skills. In response to an understanding which is deepening all the time of the virus and how it moves, an improvement which is continually improving in how we can respond to this. We're looking at how we might be able to move the restrictions that are currently hampering business. It won't happen overnight, and even in the medium to long term, it is impossible to think that we are going to be able to reverse this cascading effect and withstand the dominoes. This is a virus that until we have a vaccine, and we may never have a vaccine, how many hundreds of years have we been working on establishing a vaccine to the common cold? This is a variation on that theme. Now, I'm not a health expert, but I think we need to be thinking about how do we live with COVID-19 and how do we make it possible for us to re-establish economic engagement rather than thinking that we will suddenly be back to where life was. Big picture changes. It is still early days, but I think it's fair to say we don't think that life and business will go back to being the same as it was prior to COVID-19. Some high-level trends that we're seeing, you will be seeing, that I think will be with us for a long time. First of all, people movement and social engagement have radically changed. The aviation industry has been seriously disrupted. We have seen the case for and acceptance of more significant government intervention across sectors with the attempt to mitigate some of the worst impacts in the short term. We're seeing countries in a much more distanced way, and we're seeing international alliances strained over this period as people look to national and even state-based solutions. Obviously, we're seeing this has had a tremendous impact on businesses, and many are seeing their balance sheets weakened and cash reserves lowered. Some of those businesses, unfortunately, will not survive. And we're seeing technology and innovation lead the recovery. We're looking at tracking based on an app. Some of the great work that South Australia has been able to do in response has been because of our artificial intelligence capability. COVID's also disrupted consumer and market behaviours, and we may not see everybody go back to the high street. We may see that online and digital sales strengthen in response to this. Different sectors and different subsectors have been impacted differently. I think that has depended on their proximity to the epicenter of the restrictions, dependency on air freight and overseas market customers and tourists, the extent to which their very industry depended on face-to-face and social intimacy, our pubs, our clubs, our theatres. This was at the very core of their business. They were at the centre of the pandemic, if you like. As I say, if we look principally at our target export and investment sectors, and we do a little bit of unpacking of how this might have specifically impacted them. In no particular order, but starting with tourism, I don't need to tell our tourism operators how fundamentally affected they have been by international and interstate travel restrictions. I think it's fair to say also that it will be some time before we see real global freedom of the skies return. So where to now? Clearly, we need to pivot our visitor economy to intrastate tourism, day trippers, overnight stays in the medium term, then opening up to interstate tourism once state border restrictions are lifted. This is an area that traditionally we've been punching above our weight. I think we will find now we have a lot more competition, so it's going to be really important that we revive our offering, and that we also talk to South Australians about how fantastic it is, and what a great state that we have. And once we are free to travel, that we take advantage of that opportunity. I think it's also a chance for us to think about tourism in a different way, to refocus on digital and virtual tourism, to perhaps redesign some of our calendar events, things that historically depended on large-scale gatherings, to have a more digital and online focus to deal with those medium-term restrictions. I think we need also to be thinking about tourist attractions that will position us over the horizon and to be a very vibrant destination for tourists, particularly perhaps with focus on our strengths, nature-based and cultural arts tourism, fine food and wine experiences. Our international education sector is another sector that's been hard hit and hit early. Some of our international students were among the very first to be caught up in this pandemic, be forced to self-isolate. We saw those restrictions extend to campuses quite quickly, and the sector has been very hard hit by international and interstate travel restrictions. We still have about 6,000 of our international students outside of the state. The economy, of course, depends very largely on this sector, and we think that every 4 students creates 1 job. We think of the roll forward impact that our inability to bring international students back to the market has had. So how can we and how should we respond? I think we need to understand that students very much value the on-campus experience, and that we here in South Australia have done well in regard to virus threat management and containment. And there's been an enormous amount of effort put in by our education providers to student welfare. I think we can leverage that into the future to bring students back to our state and to give them some confidence that they will be supported whatever happens. I think there's a chance for us to promote our migration drivers. I know from my overseas experience that the single largest driver of student education experience is safety. So that's their number 1 concern when parents and students think about studying overseas. We have an enhanced safety record, and I think we can promote the value of that safety card. When we move to the health and medical industries, part of us would say, well, in a pandemic, surely they've done well. It hasn't uniformly been the case, obviously, and our private medical providers have been badly affected. I think our prognosis is that that sector has been more domestic market focused and should recover in the medium term. I think this pandemic has shown a spotlight on our AI robotics capability and our ability to pivot to telehealth in personal healthcare. Some of these themes will continue post the pandemic, and I think there's a real opportunity for us to leverage our artificial intelligence and machine learning in health and drug development to do more on the international stage. We've also seen for the first time big data in health in action. Much of the work that we've been doing in our ability to maintain and keep very good public health outcomes has been a result of great work that's been done in big data analysis. That will continue leveraging the app, and I think that this will reset how public health works into the future and positions us with a big opportunity. We've also obviously been able to diversify into medical manufacture to be able to support sovereign capability in this area, particularly with personal protective equipment and medical supplies. I think there's an opportunity for us also to look at what we can do with our nutraceutical companies. Many of them have done very well locally. I think there's an opportunity for us to improve supply and distribution chains and to help them with export of outbound finished goods. And nothing that we've seen to date, I think, tells us that we won't remain competitive in important fields of oncology, proton therapy, and clinical trials. So we will be pushing forward with those as well. In the food, wine, and agribusiness sector, there's obviously been significant impact on local channels, particularly on the food service side. But local retail and online channels have provided a safety net for some of our value-added product manufacturers. So processed food and wine, well, going through some very difficult early times. We're already starting to see some of these small green shoots emerge. Demand from overseas markets start to re-emerge, and we're hopeful that that industry, particularly in the non-perishable side of the sector, will be able to restore operations reasonably quickly. Fresh produce, of course, particularly those dependent on export markets, has been seriously disrupted by the suspension of all direct international flights. Longer term, we are working to try and look at how we can support the local industry on freight consolidation so that we can maintain some of those direct access flights and continue to drive our exports in this very important sector. If there's a silver lining, it potentially is around very heightened interest in trackability and food safety concerns. It's an area where we've always been well positioned, and I think it's something which will attract increased attention from our customers overseas, but also increased attention from potential international investment. We are seeing that in some markets that have low self-sufficiency in this food and beverage area, that their traditional supply chains have been disrupted, and that they are looking to diversify supply and are reaching back to South Australia and Australia specifically to see how we can partner with them to support driving better supply to those markets. So there are some small, I guess, silver lining signs emerging there. And we're also seeing our high value wine production move very quickly and in a very agile way to e-commerce channels. And we're starting to see some uptake in demand emerge from those channels. Finally, of course, ag tech will remain a key enabler for climate change adaptation. And we think that this will be a continued source of strength for the domestic industry and our export ambitions, but also potentially for export in and of itself to key markets. The creative industries is like a tale of two subsectors. our traditional creative industries, if you like, have faced major disruption. They have been in the eye of the storm. They are the very places where our inability to allow people to gather en masse have been incredibly disruptive. And we think that there will be potential for that to endure for some time, unfortunately. The other subsector and the other tale, of course, is on the digital side. So while social distancing has created some disruption for our traditional creative industries, our digital content creators, whether it's games, post-production, video groups, those that are leveraging the online world, will be the ultimate big winners. So gaming and video streaming in the United States has increased by 75% over this period. And we're seeing esports become increasingly competitive with public sporting events, which obviously are no longer being shown. So what does that mean in the short to medium term? Well, I think there's an opportunity to really double down on digital leisure trends, for us to really work to enhance our visual effects, gaming, e-sport capability, to work with our local companies to rapidly scale. We're very keen to link them to licensing opportunities and to new distribution platforms. We think it's a chance for us to attract new major games companies to South Australia, and a chance for us to take that capability potentially into other sectors. This rise in esport viewing, I think, will continue even when we see traditional sports re-emerge. And I think there's a chance for us to then develop a whole e-events program that will have take-up that perhaps we won't have seen historically. Our defence sector has been relatively resilient. Clearly, it's underpinned by Commonwealth contracts and has a strong, thick ice under its feet, being anchored by many of our multinational corporations. So we think that the SA defence sector should rebound and indeed may benefit from increased importance being placed on sovereign capability and the desire to stimulate the economy by accelerating some federal projects. For our, I guess, local small to medium companies, we're very focused on making sure that they get successfully embedded in international and national defence supply chains, that we are attracting value-added services in the form of engineering or technical services, cybersecurity firms also into those supply chains, and that we leverage them to then think about overseas opportunities. The space sector, our commercial space sector, is still in its infancy. Unlike all young industries and businesses, it's been impacted by the closures and the fall in business confidence. But we've seen a number of our local groups undertake successful capital raisings during this difficult period, and we think that they will be able to weather the COVID storm and stage a medium-term recovery. So we're targeting building out that ecosystem, obviously with launch capability, launch vehicle manufacture, launch propellant supply, and nano and small satellite manufacture. We'll be working to scale existing expertise in radio frequency technologies, earth stations, and data analysis. And we'll be working much more closely with the federal government to strengthen our entrepreneurial commercial space sector and help with technology transfer, make sure that we've got a smoother runway to standing up this very critical virgin sector. The high-tech sector has really, I guess, had a spotlight shone on it through this crisis. We have all seen very up close and personal the importance of artificial intelligence and big data, but we've also seen in a very immediate way the threat of cyber attacks. So I think it's unlikely that we will go back from this point. We have seen how these things can make a very immediate impact in everybody's daily lives. As a result, we think there are opportunities to leverage e-work and virtual communication solution providers, and for us to really scale up our cybersecurity product and service offerings. We'll be encouraging national and international service providers to think about South Australia's very stable and high quality workforce, and to think about establishing virtual branches, potentially leveraging people working from home in South Australia to support national and international operations. We'll be considering investing in next generation IT backbone and digital connectivity that may be able to allow us to automatically connect and collect and anonymize data, giving us a real competitive advantage in terms of data sets we hold and data sets we can leverage locally. Obviously, we'll be incentivizing carbon neutral data centres, leveraging renewable clean energy. And we think that the spotlight that's been shone on our cybersecurity, AI and data analytics will help us to double down on R&D and development capabilities. Our resource sector, ever resilient, has taken a little bit of a hit in terms of adverse resource pricing. With the exception of gold, we've seen some price pressure on iron ore and copper. We think these will rebound as the Chinese economy rebounds, and we're already seeing green shoots of that just in pricing over the last week or so. We believe that it's important for us to keep focus on clean energy projects, and we are already seeing international investors return to consideration of those. And we think there's a big opportunity in carbon capture and storage and hydrogen production for export, leveraging international groups that are looking to reduce CO2 emissions. There's a lot going on at the moment. It remains a somewhat opaque picture, but we are already starting to look to the future. We think that the recent low numbers of positive cases in Australia and South Australia, together with the high uptake of the online app, give us a good base from which we can start to think about moving forward. As an agency, we're wanting to provide support to each of you during this difficult time. We want you to emerge on the other side more agile and stronger. Things continue to evolve, but we want to be giving you information and data to help you think about how do you take the COVID-19 lemon and make lemonade out of it? How can you think about your business model in a different way, adapt to changes, think about getting to customers interstate and internationally in a different way? How can you take advantage of these disrupted supply chains? We don't have a very clear picture at the moment. We know that it will continue for some time to be a changing landscape, but we're very committed to adapting, to working with you as you're forced to adapt to changing circumstances. Let me finish there and open up to questions. I've got my Brains Trust online, so I hope we're going to be able to respond to specific issues that you have.
Thank you very much, Leonie, very comprehensive. I'll read out some questions that have come through. This one from John Sergeant. It says, thanks for a very comprehensive summary. Great work DTI is doing. Air freight is a challenge. How is rail, road and sea freight to South Australian holding up at present?
Justin, can I throw this one to you to respond to?
So currently our focus has been very much on trying to create more capacity in the air freight network. Just over a month ago, we lost all of our direct international flights out of Adelaide, some 700 tonnes of air freight that evaporated in a week. So our focus is very much on trying to get our highly perishable products back into markets that exporters have fought so hard to develop over the years. As Leonie mentioned, the seaports are still moving, and their sea freight is moving reasonably freely. In fact, some of those products that were previously going by air are now being frozen and going by sea freight. The cross-border freight movements are still occurring. The essential transport drivers and transport companies have been to be essential, and so their movement of freight via borders is being regulated, but is still being enabled. So there's also air freight between interstate destinations. So Toll and Virgin are still operating their interstate network, which is serving Adelaide at the moment on much reduced services.
Excellent. One more question. We have time for just two questions, but Jordan Brooke Barnett, how will the department spearhead diplomatic engagement with the key markets to clear the way for business once the virus subsides? How will we ensure that South Australian businesses are supported better than other states once the key markets like Hong Kong reopen?
That's a very good question. Thank you for it. We're not waiting for the virus to be clear or contained before we engage. We're already in conversation with the Singapore government in regard to their self-sufficiency needs. They're an example of where traditional supply chains have been disrupted for them. A lot of the product that they historically have been able to import from China and Malaysia is no longer able to be imported, and also there are some concerns in regard to quality. So we're already working through with them what are their precise supply requirements, what pricing parameters are they able to accommodate, and how can we quickly move to supply to them. So we're already working with them on a, if you like, a sort of a government to government level, but in all of the markets where we have our international network, we have people on the ground talking to importers, distributors, customers about orders for particular South Australian commodities. Now, like us, many markets have got reduced food service businesses operating, and there's a need therefore to go through retail and online channels, but we are seeing and tracking very closely demand. So we're expecting Japan, for example, to reopen post the Golden Week period, which ostensibly the country has been shut down for, and we are talking with importers specifically, for example, in regard to tuna and demand for that product, but products more generally where we're in discussions. Megan, I don't know whether you wanted to just sort of talk about some of our other markets where we're actively engaged in trying to keep supply chains open or growing them.
Sure. Thanks, Leonie. I suppose I'd just highlight, we do have different approaches to each of the different markets, and they are, of course, evolving all the time. One thing I'd highlight, though, that in some sectors, South Australia will win when Australia wins. So we do also play at kind of in the Team Australia tent as well. So something like international education, it's really critical that Australia as a whole is seen as a safe destination for international students, for South Australia to bring back our share of that market and be successful. So we're actively participating. You mentioned in your question the sort of diplomatic efforts, I suppose, where maybe small d diplomacy, but we certainly are very much engaged with national level task force operation around Australia's reputation as a good partner, as a safe place to invest, a safe place to send your students, a safe place to visit. So a lot of sectors benefit from us pushing South Australia's interests through a coordinated Team Australia approach.
Thank you. While we're talking international education, we have a couple of questions here which I'll summarise from Ashnish Wagley. Pardon me if I pronounce that incorrectly, but education agents are responsible for sourcing and placing of students in institutions, accounting for the placement of over 80% of students. Are they looking at any welfare opportunities for this sector?
In regard to the agents specifically, I'd be pointing you to some of the small to medium business support programs which have been stood up both at a state level and at a federal level. And the recent education support package that was announced by Minister Ridgway was more specifically focused at, I guess, your customers, the international students themselves, and making sure that they were supported and cared for and remained in market. I think we can connect you, Ashish, with our head of international education, but what we are planning at the moment is looking at how do we restore our product as quickly as public health restrictions will allow, and having been able to do that, taking a very proactive approach to agreeing with our health and police colleagues the basis on which international students will be able to return to the market, and then again working with the agents on a very aggressive digital marketing campaign. So in terms of the immediate help, I'd be pointing you to our SME business support packages. In terms of the future, we hope to be able to, with you, restore this very important business quickly. And we are already doing a lot of deep thinking about how we go about that and liaison work in the background. So stay with us and please stay in touch with us as a department. We can connect you with Tully, who heads up our international education group, and he'll be able to share more fully what our thinking is at the moment.
Thank you. And I'll just bring this back to one last question as we nearly hit 11:30, but this is from Ryan McClellan. Due to the rapidly growing need for diagnostic X-ray imaging associated with COVID, MicroX is scaling up for supply. How can the department help to ensure our export needs are met?
Very timely question. We have already reached out to the Department of Foreign Affairs to see how we might be able to connect MicroX to some work that they are doing with our regional and Pacific neighbours. We're also, I guess, reaching back to our international network to try and explore how we might be able to generate interest internationally. But perhaps this is a specific conversation that I think we are set to have in a direct way with you and with some potential channel partners later this week. So I hope we're going to be able to answer your questions more specifically then. Megan, I don't know whether you wanted to talk more broadly about some of our health equipment exporters or health-related suppliers.
Yeah, I think this is the health industry sector is really one where we're seeing different opportunities emerge in different markets as they ride out their own health pandemic issues in their own markets. So as everyone's confronting the progression of this pandemic at different paces, we're sort of trying to keep our market intel as live as possible. It's very much a moving feast into the different markets, but certainly in the UK and in Europe, particularly into Germany, we've had some opportunities for some of our local companies. And we're exploring equally opportunities in the US for some medical equipment supply or partnership on product solutions. So there is quite a bit of activity in the area, a little bit hard to know where it will all land. And I think it's largely to do with the fact that a lot of our trading partners are themselves in the very midst of a crisis. We're in the lucky situation of starting to envisage relaxing restrictions and to imagine getting back to business as usual at some point, but some of our trading partners aren't there yet. So it's probably a case-by-case basis in those markets, but certainly an area of active discussion, and we'll be prosecuting every opportunity.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to wrap it up there. We do have more questions that we haven't been able to answer, but we will answer them and put them up online. There are also some comments there about connections. We'll endeavour to do that over the next 24 hours. But big thank you to Leonie, great comprehensive presentation, and for support from Justin and Megan. Thank you very much. DTI is there to help you, so please reach out. We're very happy to take your call and discuss how we can support you. Please stay on and fill out the poll. That will help us make sure that the webinars in the future are exactly what you're looking for. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for engaging with us.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Stay well.
Thank you.